Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam
for inviting me, Brother Ibrahim. Nice to see Professor Mohsin after a long time. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh there. And assalamu alaikum to Sheikh Abdul Talik as well from Cape Town. Really, Sheikh Professor Mohsin has done most of the hard work. So, Jazakallah khair, and for me, it's the easy conclusion part. So I want to look at more of how to understand the Nakba from the West, for us living in the West and being active. As you have already mentioned, that Nakba is a process. We shouldn't think of it as something that happened in 1947-48. And we can break it down into three parts: pre-47-48, the period of 47-48, and third part being from 48 till today. And looking at those three parts, the first thing that strikes you are several aspects. That here was a small group of people, and they still are a small group of people relative to the global society, transgressing most of the international norms, international laws, and international standards. And despite that, they get away with it. So that's what we need to understand, is why Israel and the Zionist movement have been able to do the things they have been able to do over the past 75 years and more. And the first part, I think, is the realization that Zionism is entangled with colonialism. And the birth of Zionism itself, political Zionism, and the creation of the State of Israel was on the back of the British Empire and British colonialist project. And I'm not simply talking about the Balfour Declaration here, which is the most famously quoted item, and I don't undermine that. But there was something else the British did, and three particular things that are very significant for us. After having occupied and created Mandate Palestine, they allowed, or rather, the first thing they did, they stopped the European Jews from immigrating from the mainland Europe, in particularly German, into Britain, and moved them to Palestine. And this is a very big strategic ploy by the British themselves to make sure that there was no Jews coming into Britain and facilitate them out. The second thing they did was to help the then Zionist movement and the acquisition of land to be prioritized to the Zionists. So while they were occupying Palestine, they helped that to take place. And the third thing they did, of course, is to help in the economy and the building of the military might of the Zionist movement. And it is interesting to learn that over 30,000 Zionists served under the British as military men. They were trained by the British, and they were actually provided with first-hand experiences in Italy under the British protectorate, and they created their own flag. And therefore, by the time 1947-48 came, then Britain was in a position to really, if you like, strike the death blow to Palestine by handing over the issue to the United Nations at the time when they knew that the Zionist movement had become strong enough. And this was, if you like, the pre-Zionist, pre-acute Nakba phase. And that part of Nakba, I think, is something we should also talk about and understand, to hopefully trying to counter it in what is happening now. And therefore, we enter the second part, the acute phase of the Nakba. Of course, the United Nations at the time was very much a Western-centric institute, and they voted with a majority of 3 votes, just by 3 votes, to split Mandate Palestine and give the Zionist entity 55% of Palestine, when they only owned something like 7% of the land. So the Zionists owned 7% of the land, despite everything they had done, and the United Nations decreed that they should be given 55%. And this really was a dilemma for the Zionists. And it was a big quandary, because how can they then present to the international community the legitimacy of creating a Jewish-only state on a territory in which they have minimum amount of people? At that time, they had something like 37%, and negligible amount of land. Yet they were claiming exclusivity. And you see the Nakba then entering, or the acute phase of the Nakba, entering into the logic of Zionism. Now, we can argue whether this was accidental, or whether it was designed and planned ballot, and we can go into all that. But this is not the place for it. But as what unfolded in the next year was the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. And that ethnic cleansing that took place in 1947-48, of which we have now still got 6 million or 7 million Palestinian refugees, and the denial of the right of return. And on the other side, the appropriation of the Palestinian properties and assets. But that was not enough for the state of Israel to exist. So they had to do something else. And here they had two things. First, the passing of the present absentee law, in which those Palestinians who even managed to get back, the properties and assets were not returned back to the people because they became present absentees. And the second aspect was the right of return law on the flip side that allowed any individual who could be classified as a Jew around the world to have the right to return to Israel. And those two factors, in effect, made sure the dispossession of the Palestinians, the loss of their land, the loss of their territory, enriched the Zionist project. And on the other side, it also allowed the Zionist movement at the moment, at that time, to invite the global Jews into Palestine. Now, for me, the last 75 years really have seen that the Zionist movement has not been successful in this factor because, as the motion has alluded, that more than 50% of Jews, even after 75 years, live outside Israel. More importantly, is that those Jews who live in Israel, we can split them on a spectrum. Not all Jews who live in Israel are first and foremost Zionists. Second is many Jews, and there's a varying estimate, there hasn't been a conclusive study, but the range from between 25 and 50% of the Jews living in Israel have a dual nationality. And that is very interesting, that here are people who are, or the Zionist movement, trying to influence the Jewish global society, that Israel is a home for them. Yet those who are residing there have got one leg, if you like, outside the country and another in it. And that, I suppose, a weakness is something we have to look at and study. But what I want to really emphasize in the 5 minutes I've got left is how should we read this? And importantly, how should we read that the Zionist movement has been allowed to get away with only the fact that now from 1947 up to today, the passing of the laws, the dozens of the discriminatory laws, the over 600 checkpoints, the siege of Gaza, the continuous bombing and killing of the Palestinians. Of course, one is the fact that what we see is the Zionist project being a legacy of colonialism. So first, Britain saw it that Israel is doing what they could not carry on after 47, 48. And the United States of America really saying that what the Israelis are doing is what they did to the Native Americans. You know, the ethnically cleansing them, the herding them into the lands and reservations, the appropriating of all their assets, and then managing the individual body. And you can see that being replicated in Israel as well. Of course, there's other aspects. I don't want to undermine the geopolitical position of Israel or where it is, the need of Israel for arms sale to destabilize the region and oil and so forth. They are there, but I'm looking at more psychological aspects and the sociological, if you like, of why the West feels a relationship with Israel. And you can see that what Israel is doing is what already European colonialist power had done and what America has done to its people as well. And therefore, there's this, if you like, a family resemblance between what Israel is doing and what America did and is doing and what European colonialist imperialist power did in the past. And that relationship, of course, is very important because they can identify with each other and they can carry that forward. But in there, I think it's also a weakness because the global society, especially for those of us living in the West, understand that there is a rise of awareness and particularly post-colonial studies, decolonialization, and the fact of what European powers did in the past is now coming to fore where many countries are ashamed to mention it. And we need to work and exploit that arena rather, and to make sure that we have a counter narrative to colonialism, past colonialism, and then bring it forward to what is happening today in Israel. Of course, what I'm not trying to tell you that what Israel is doing is exactly what European powers did or what America did to the Native Americans, because there's a big difference. First and foremost, as a settler state, most of the Europeans, when they went, they saw themselves, although as outsiders, superior, which the Israelis do and the Zionist people do, but they also, at one stage, in every settler colonial position, came to assimilate the indigenous people, either inferior or otherwise. In Israel, you have an opportunity, particularly after the 2018, the passing of the nation-state law, in which it is now categorical, and no Zionists or Israelis are trying to hide that Israel is uniquely for the Jewish people. And the second part of that nation-state law states that Jewish settlements, which are in the West Bank, are part of the national value of the state. In effect, we have the total blurring of 57 area and 47 area into everything between the river and the sea that is controlled by the state of Israel in one form or the other, either through discriminatory laws in what is called proper Israel, and through military occupation in the West Bank, and through siege in Gaza. And this law explicitly that claims this whole territory, the superiority of Jews over non-Jews, is something we should intervene in and be able to export. And of course, this not only requires us to engage the wider community, which we should do at all levels, but to be able to expose the fallacy upon which Israel itself legitimizes. The very fact that its foundation is based on racism, the very fact that its existence means the ethnic cleansing and the genocide of the indigenous people, the fact that it is now calling openly that the Israelis who had exiled themselves for over a millennia, thousands of years, somehow had a right of return, and those who remain on the land, the Palestinians, have got less right to exist there. And this disparity, I think, is something that we need to work on, both at not only academic level, but at the general level of general population. An average person in Europe, in Africa, can relate to this, and particularly in South Africa. The other thing that brings me towards in the last couple of minutes is we need to be proactive. We have to stop trying to work within the paradigm of the nation state. We have to think of how on our own Muslim heritage and culture, and understand that what a nation like Israel is doing, that it is a nation has become a state for the Jewish people. And that differentiation between nation, state, and a people is something that we need to break down. And to talk about a region in which, from our perspective, from the time of Umar bin Khattab and Salahuddin Ayyubi, both of them have shown us that we can have this land in which we can allow the existence of all people, provided, and this is the important part, that the rightful heir and the legitimacy has to be to the Muslims, because not only of the historical fact, but for the rightful existence of the Palestinians and how they serve the community. And that confidence can only come when we know our history, when we also know the present situation of what the Zionist state is doing. And we also can differentiate between the different Jewish groups, because what we need to do is we need to be able to empower those Jews who are themselves a very small minority at the moment, who call themselves the Palestinian Jews, or those Jews who are willing to understand, to live in a plural society. And they can also understand that what Zionism is doing in the name of Judaism, in the name of appropriating the rights of the Jews right across the world, silencing their voice and saying that Israel as a state is for the Jews, whereas they're saying, no, it's not. We cannot speak in our name. And they're the ones we need to work with. We have to therefore come out and be able to articulate not just what happened in the past, what's happening now, but how the future should look. And I think that is the work that we need to do as Muslims, as political activists, and scholars. Jazakallah khair.
Barakallahu Feek, Brother Dr. Ismail Patel, the founder and chair of Friends of Al-Aqsa, for that insight on the history of the Nakba, the various stages of the Nakba, as well as the strategic lessons and the directions and the pointers going forward.